Okay, so welcome back, class, to today's topic. I want to take you through these particular topics because they're very important. And I want also you to take part in following this particular tutorial or this particular recording step by step, because this now will lead to you understanding now more of what we need to cover in PLSQL and of course on the advanced units that are still coming ahead. Now, the first thing for us to understand is introducing something called the SQL Cursor. And if you remember, even before this, we were able to talk about retrieving data with PLSQL. We were able to talk about manipulating data still with PLSQL. And remember all this, when we talk about retrieving, this means that we are able to select, are you able to select some values from the database using the PLSQL block, which of course we are talking about the anonymous block. Are you able to manipulate? And when you talk about manipulation, it means that are you able to insert some values? Are you able to update? Are you able to delete? So remember, all these are connected. All these are connected to DML. Whether you talk about select statement, which comes as a retrieving point, if you talk about manipulating data with PLSQL, which is well connected to either using the update, delete, or insert. Now, so on top of that, I want now to do some introduction. Let's say introducing SQL Cursor. And when we talk about SQL Cursor, remember this one is not like a broad topic as far as I'm doing an introduction to it, but we have a topic or we have a chapter that fully covers the SQL Cursor or the cursors in a more detailed point. Now, for this point, we need to understand, first of all, what is a cursor? So when we talk about a cursor is a pointer to the private memory area allocated by the Oracle server. So in this case, we can say a cursor, let's say a cursor is a pointer. You see, a cursor is a pointer to what? To the private memory area, to the private memory area, which does what? Which memory? This private memory area is actually allocated by the Oracle server. The Oracle server. So for this case, it's actually like a point in the Oracle server. And what is this private memory area doing? You see, once this private memory area has been allocated, then it means that all the SQL or all the SQL statements are actually being processed under that particular point. So just know that a cursor is a pointer to the private memory area because it's actually helpful when it comes to pointing. So it's actually something that directs the SQL statements to be processed within the private area or within the private memory area. I know that when it comes to database administration workshop or database workshop 1, we will be able to understand more of administration, and we will start with something called the Oracle database architecture, where we will talk about the components of the Oracle server, and we will be able to talk about the memory, we'll be able to talk about the background processes, and of course the storage areas within the database. So for this case, why is SQL important? Not SQL, but SQL Cursor is important. So it is basically meant, or it's basically used to handle the result set of a select statement. So whenever, so you can say this cursor is used to handle the result set. You see the result set of the select the select statement. So whenever these select statements are being processed, then it's actually the work of the cursor to capture the result set. That means the output or the outcomes coming from that point. Now, another point here is that we also have the types of SQL cursors, and we have the types of SQL cursors. So number one here, we are talking about number one, we're talking about the explicit. Number one, we're talking about the explicit cursor. Remember, this is just an introduction, so I'm going to give a brief information about this. So when we talk about explicit cursor for this case, we are actually talking about cursors that are declared by the programmer, or that are actually declared and created, or those that are actually created by the programmer. Now, number two, we talk about implicit cursor. So when we talk about implicit cursor here, these are cursors that are being managed. You see, they are being managed, or they are being created and managed internally by the Oracle server to process SQL statements. So when it comes to you getting, or you encountering this particular term, the explicit and implicit, because one is the opposite of the other. If you encounter the word explicit, just know automatically that this refers to the ones that are being created or that are being done by the programmer. But in this case, remember, we're talking about the cursor. So it means that for this particular cursor, these are cursors that are being created by you as a user, by me as a user. But those that are created by the system, or those that are beyond us as users or programmers, then they're referred to as implicit cursors. Now, these two terms, the implicit cursor and explicit cursor, are not only attached to cursors, but you will still encounter them as we move forward. But just have the concept here that explicit, it means it is you. Implicit, it means it is the system that actually does a lot of work. So for this case, it means that the SQL or the select statements are supposed to be processed, and we can actually process them implicitly, or we can process them explicitly. Remember, it is actually the system that does a lot of work. So for introduction purposes to SQL cursor, just know that we have the two types of SQL cursor, the explicit cursor and the implicit cursors. Now, so what happens is, when the Oracle server allocates a private area or a private memory area, this particular area is actually called the context area. So here we can say when the Oracle server allocates the private memory area called memory area, then the area, then it is the area is called, let me put in caps, context area. Now, what is the work of context area? So the works of context area, because that's been created by the Oracle server, it means that the processing of SQL statements are supposed to take place within the context area. So this takes care of SQL statements processing. Yeah. So that is a point. And when we talk about the SQL statements being processed, this means that the SQL statements are supposed to be parsed and processed in this particular area. Parsed, you see, we have this particular term we always refer to as parsed. Now, what we mean by that term? It means that the syntax of the select statement is supposed to be checked, and the system has to verify that whatever thing we are supplying is okay. Now, on the side of introduction again to SQL statements, I want to talk about the SQL attributes so that we can probably end the introducing SQL Cursor, since we have another chapter ahead, which is actually in line with the SQL Cursor. But here we have something called the SQL Cursor attributes. Let's say SQL Cursor attributes for what? For implicit cursor. Implicit cursor. Okay, so you'll find that number one, we have something called SQL %found. Number two, we have SQL %not found. And number three, we have SQL %row count. That is it. And then again, we have SQL, I'll just explain, SQL Cursor attributes for explicit cursors, explicit cursor, and okay, so on this one again, we have number one, we have % found. Number two, we have % not found. Number three, we have % row count, %row count. Now, this is actually like something called the attributes, because you see at the end, as long as you're talking about the SQL cursor, how can we apply these cursors? So to apply these cursors, it means that since we have the types of SQL cursor, that is the explicit cursor and implicit cursors, we have to find a way on how to apply each one and how to use each cursor based on each category. So when we want, or when the system applies the SQL cursor attributes, because you see, for us, we need again to tell the system that just do this for us. So we are supposed to use the cursors that are supposed to be attached to the system, or system generated cursors. So the SQL cursor attributes for implicit cursor, for example, we have the first one, which is SQL %found. And this actually tells you or answers the question of a Boolean value. That means true or false. Whether the value is found, then it is true. SQL %not found. If the value that is being searched is not there, then of course we can expect to have a Boolean value as the answer, true, false. And then of course we have the SQL %row count. This actually counts the number of columns or the number of rows in that particular table. So how many columns do you want to delete, or how many columns have been rows have been deleted? How many rows have been selected? How many rows have been updated? You see how many rows have been inserted. So it's actually the work of this particular attribute to count it for you. Now, so the difference between cursor attributes for implicit cursor and cursor attributes for explicit cursor is now the SQL. So you see that we have SQL %found in implicit cursor, we have %found in explicit cursor. We have SQL %not found in implicit cursor, we have %not found in explicit cursor. We have SQL %row count, we have %row count. So as a matter of introducing SQL cursor, just know based on this document that we have what is a cursor, and we've said that a cursor is a pointer to the private memory area located by the Oracle server. What is the name of this private memory area? It is actually called the context area. And what is the main objective there? This actually takes care of any SQL statements that are being processed. And of course, how many types of SQL cursors? We have two types. We have explicit cursor and we have implicit cursor. So this actually marks the end of introducing SQL cursor for us to, because we will actually use one of them, one of the attributes. So we don't need to be like as new as we are. At least we should have a clue of what is happening. But remember, we still have a whole chapter 4 that covers SQL cursors. Now, having said that, I need now to probably take you through. If you remember very well that we talked about, we actually talked about writing control structures. I think that was our last, topic. So when it comes to writing control structures, here, it's all about controlling the flow of execution. You see, when we want to control the flow of execution or just to test for the conditions, we expect to have a certain flow. And for this case, I know we did actually cover like 2 of them. For example, I showed you that one type we have is if statements. Number 2, we have like case expression. I think we talked about this one on our last class. And then number 3, we have loops. So for loops, we did not actually talk about it. So this is exactly what I want us to talk about, the loops, so that we can terminate on that particular chapter. But remember that we will still come and revisit it. So the main objective here is just to finish on the loops so that we can again proceed to the next module. So here I'm going to have it as loops. Okay, sorry for that. So let me just clear the screen. So when we talk about loops here, we have different types of loops. And one thing about loops is that if we want to execute a block of code several number of times, then we can actually use a loop. Now, in general, statements are executed sequentially, and the first statement in a function is executed first, followed by the second, and of course, followed by the third, and so on. So remember that we will always have the first statement being executed. For example, if I give you a scenario, I want you to display, let's say 10 employees. These 10 employees in a department, each one will be accounted for. For example, the system will actually look for the first employee and then display the record. It will go back to the table again and look whether we have another employee. Yes, we have, because remember there are 10. So it will look for the number 2. It will display. It will go back, look for number 3, display. Look for number 4, display. Look for number 9, it displays. Look for number 10, it displays. Now, when it tries to go back and look for number 11, then it finds out that the total number of employees was actually 10. So what it will do, it will tend to stop at that. In other words, it will exit. And that is the end of that particular loop. So that is just a scenario that covers that norm. Now, programming languages provide various control structures that allow for more complicated execution path. A loop statement for this case allows us to execute a statement or group of statements multiple times. And for this case, so here I can say that a loop, if given a definition, is a statement that allows us, or that allows execution of statements, or group of statements multiple times, you see, or group of statements multiple times. So that is a definition that covers what? That covers a loop. So if you go to any programming language, you will realize that we have a loop attached to that. If you go to any language, you cannot actually miss to have a loop, because what happens if you want to execute a statement multiple times, then automatically you should have that. So when we talk about PLSQL or PLSQL loops, you see, like PLSQL itself provides different types of loops that handle the looping requirements. So what are some of these loops? And of course, what are their descriptions? So for this case, I'm going to mention some, and then we'll look how they are. So number one, we have something called the basic loop. Now for the basic loop, this is just the basic or the foundation of us understanding what a loop is. You see, for this case, it means that the sequence of statements is executed, and then the control resumes at the top of the loop. You see, we are talking about a loop that has the end, the start and the end. But remember, we are talking about the sequence of statements that are being executed in between this particular loop. Once this loop actually counts like 10, if there are 10 records that needs to be displayed using this particular loop, then it means that it will start from the first one and then it ends once the number of characters ends. Now, we also have another type of loop, number two, it's actually called the while loop. We will see them by example. Now, for this particular type of loop, we have a repeat of statement, you see, or it actually repeats a statement or group of statements while a given condition is true, while a condition is true. You see, for the basic loop, if you give the statement to retrieve like 10 rows, it will only display the 10 rows at a go. Of course, it will be instant, but in this case, it's instance, but the system already has done the calculation so that it has seen all the records that are there, and it has actually issued all or displayed all the records that are there. For the while loop, it's a little bit different. You see, we can have a condition that what happens to this condition? If this condition is true, then do what? Then display the record or display that particular row. So in short, while loop actually tests the condition before executing the loop body. So that is, then we also have number three. We have the for loop. We will see that by examples. We have the for loop. Now, what happens at the for loop? For the for loop, it means that it executes a sequence of statements. For loop executes a sequence of statements multiple times and abbreviates the code that manages the loop variable. You see? So here, if we have multiple statements, or if we have a group of statements or a sequence of statements, they are going to be executed multiple times. So it's more similar to the while loop, because if we are to use, let's say, for example, we want to capture the same data using the while loop, we can still attain the same results from the for loop. So these are just but the three types of loops. And we can just have an example on how we can query this. We can just have an example now. We can query each one, and you can still move forward and look at a lot of information that revolves around that. So in other words, when we talk about the types of loops or the types of PLSQL loops, we have, for example, the basic loop. These are the main ones. We have the for loop. We have the while loop. Of course, you can find, I think we also have something called the nested loop. So you need to do at least some few research on that and see what happens. Now, remember, when using these loops, we are talking about the execution of statements or the execution of SQL statements. And of course, we can talk about multiple times, but we need to have some control statements again. We need to have some control statements. So when we talk about control statements, these statements needs to control the behavior of these looping processes. Now, for example, we have this term, exit. You see, we have the exit statement. What happens to this? When you talk about the exit statement as the first control statement, you have to tell the system, at what point do you expect this particular loop to exit? You see, we can talk about, we want to display 10 records or 10 records of employees. Now, what happens? You see, the system will tend to count number 1, it will display, count number 2, it will display number 3. What happens when it reaches 10? We don't want it to proceed to 11, 12 of that. We want the system to exit at 11. So before retrieving 11, it has to exit first. And this is why we need to have some control statements. Now, we also have another control statement, which we can actually refer to as the continue statement. So we have continue. So for this one, continue statement. For this one, it means that you can continue. You see, it can stop and continue. So you can actually restrict or have some form of control. What happens? Let it stop or let it exit at 10 and then continue from 15. Let it exit from 10 and then continue from 15. So the continue statement causes the loop to skip the remainder of its body and immediately retest its condition prior to reiterating. The exit statement completes the loop and control passes to the statement immediately, or the control passes to the statement immediately after the loop ends. And then finally, we also have another one called the go-to statement. So what does this do? The go-to statement. So the go-to statement, this again transfers control to the labeled statement. And this is more on the advanced level of PLSQL, using the PLSQL loops. Though it's not advised to use the go-to statement in your program, but just know the concept that it transfers control to the labeled statement. Now, in this case, I want us now to have a look at how each one of these can be mapped out. How can we execute the basic loop statement? Let's start from that point. How can we execute the loop, the basic loop? Remember, we're starting from the first one, the basic loop. So now let me clear the screen. Now, when you talk about executing any PLSQL code, especially if it is your first time to open the SQL Plus, one thing we have to do here is, first of all, to perform this. Set server output on. And then remember, this one actually ensures that the server is up and running. This one ensures that the server is up and running. And I'm sorry, because I know that I promised you guys that we'll be using the SQL developer. So my SQL developer is not working fully, but I'm going to perform some configuration so that we can use probably when we will in the next class. Now, so when it comes to using the basic loop or loop, remember we need to have like a sequence of statements. And of course, this sequence of statements must be embedded in between the syntax. So whenever you want to use a loop, you must start with the word loop. And then in between, you must have the SQL statements. So you must have the SQL statements. Then you must end what? End loop. So you start with the keyword loop, and then you terminate it with end loop. Now, let's actually do it more practical. Let's do something more practical now. Now, remember, we're talking about the basic loop. And in this case, we are going to apply some of these controls. We're going to apply some of these controls and see what happens. So here it means that, first of all, we are supposed to declare. Then I can declare, let's say, Z. Now, for this particular Z, remember it's a variable. So I want to assign, or I want to initialize it, such that it takes up a value. Let me have it as 20. Then come and say what? Begin. So I am done declaring the variable, and I am done initializing the variable. So what happens next is I want to start with the word loop. And then I want, first of all, to display the first value. So I'll just use dbms underscore output dot put underscore line into bracket. We need to display the first value because the starting value here is Z. So I'm going to give it Z. Then we expect now to give some conditions here. So I want to give, like, for every Z, the first value, after the first value, I want the second value to be, let me just use caps, plus 1. You see, Z equals to Z plus 1. That is the condition. Then, not even the condition, but I'm giving the incremental value. Now, the next part now, to give the condition, it means now that if, this is where the condition comes in now, if Z is greater than 50, then what? If Z is greater than 50, then what do we do? What is the control statement? Then exit. This is where now I am applying the control. Exit. If at all Z is going to be greater than 50, then you have to exit. And then because it's an if statement, if you remember, I have to end if. You see, this one is an if statement. If, then end if. Then from there, I need to end the loop. Because I started the loop, I need to end the loop. Now, from that point, we need now to, we can even finish on that. Let me end and then / and press enter. Look at that. Now it means that I have successfully managed to count. You see, I have successfully managed to count the 50 values. Now look at this. The value, the starting value for my case is what? Is 20. If I had actually placed 0 here, then that could actually act as my starting value. Here I've actually given 20 as the first value. And you can see the moment the loop starts, the first value has to be printed out, which is Z. And this is 20. Now, what is the condition? It will be not the condition, the incremental measure. Here it means that the value, the starting value, one should be added to the next value. So it will be 20 plus 1, 21, 21 plus 1, 22, 22 plus 1, 23. And then what is the condition now? The condition is that if the value exceeds 50, then the loop has to stop or has to exit. In other words, it has to stop and then give you that. So what happens is, if I can go now down here, you can see now that the loop has actually stopped at what? At 50. The loop has actually stopped at 50. That is the basic loop. That is the basic loop. Now, we can still modify it. We can still modify it, and we can actually capture the same what? The same value. What happens if I don't want to use the if statement? What happens if I don't want to use the statement? So let me just, if I don't want to use the if statement, I can still do what? I can still go directly. If I don't want to use the the if statement, I can still come here and say exit when X is greater than 50. You see, you can still give some condition there. It's not a must for you to give a what? It's not a must for you to use the if statement. You can end up at that point. You can end up at that point. And then just say end loop. And then end. And then when, okay, I'm sorry. Just did something else. Instead of Z, I've actually given, so let me just do this. Yeah. So instead of Z, I've given X, Z. And then end loop, and then end. Yeah, so you can see it's actually the same scenario. So it doesn't mean that you have to give or bring in the if statement. You can still even execute it without putting the if statement. Okay. Now let's move forward to the for loop. Not even before the for loop, let's talk about the while loop. So on the while loop, this is actually a statement. A while loop is a statement in PLSQL programming language that repeatedly executes a target statement as long as the condition or as long as the given condition is true. So here we are talking about the condition is true. You see, as long as the condition is true. It's more similar, but we will end up, if you look at it keenly, you'll find that we have a slight difference. We have a slight difference between the basic loop, the for loop, and the while loop. Now, for the while loop, because now we have almost the same format, I'm going to use, let's say, A. A is a number. Let me put full colon. I want to give it like 10, just a small portion. Let me have the begin. Now, here it means that we need now to have the condition. So we can say while A is less than 10, while A, as long as A is less than 10, we retrieve it. So because the exact value, the initialized value is 20, let me give it like 30 and then loop. So this is the condition. While A is less than 30, loop, and then here we want to give now the DBMS underscore output dot put underscore line into bracket. We can give a statement. We can give a statement that the value, let's say, the value of A is, so I can give it like that, and then give it, sorry, I don't have these simples. Okay, so pipe simple. So I don't know where it is in my keyboard. Let me find it. Okay. Then I will have A and then put that bracket. Okay. Then from there, I want now to have this. So A full colon equals to A plus 1. Now let me have like plus 5. I can add it. Remember the previous one for the basic loop, we actually added 1. Here I can say plus 5. So it will be 10 plus 5, 15, 15 plus 5, 20, 20 plus 5, 25, 25 plus 5, 30, and the loop stops. So that means that the condition is okay. Then from there, we end loop, and then we end. Now let's see, press enter, look at that. Here we are looking at this particular simple. Okay, I think, okay. Let me even put without, I don't know, is there space? Okay, I think the space in between this. Okay, let me just bring it. Okay. Now look at that. So this one, the problem was actually here, the space between the two samples. So the value of A is 10, the value of A is 15, the value of A is 20, the value of A is 25. Why? Because the incremental values means that A plus 5. If I had put A plus 1, then it means that it will start from 10, then 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, up to 30. And look at this. When you had 25 plus, when you had 25 plus 5, it becomes 30. Now, the condition is not true because when you talk about A is less than 30, that is not included, you see? But if you say A is less or equals to 30, then that is going to be included. So that is for the while loop, as simple as that. Now, that brings us to the for loop. For the for loop, how is it different? And we can still use the same for loop to portray or to bring up the same examples or the same points, the same example that you used here. So the condition here is that A less than 30. So let's use the for loop to just bring the same thing. Now, to use the for loop, remember we are supposed to apply the word for. And here I can just declare a value. Let me have A the same way we had. Let me have it as number 10. This time around, I don't want to associate any value or to initialize the variable. And I will come to begin. Then for for loop, it's actually called a for loop because you will be start with the what? The for. You will start with that keyword called for. So here I can talk about for A in. So we have 10 and then dot 30. You see, this is where the condition is. So it means that display for me all the values between 10 to 30. You see, with the two dots. You're supposed to display, if you put it like 10 to 100, it will give you all the values in between. It will give you all the values in between. Then from there, you can just have loop and press enter. Now, here it means that we expect to have the same, let me just, here, we can capture the same information. Let's say the value, let's say the value of A as for loop. Let me just, so that you can know. The value of A as for loop is what? Press enter, and then we end the loop. Here we don't have like the mental. Put that, press enter. Look at that. So for this one, it will give us everything. It will give us anything that comes in between 10 to 30. Between 10 to 30. For A in 10 to 30 loop. For A in 10, 30, then we loop. So for this one, this is a for loop. This one is a for loop. And then this one is a while loop. And then the other one is the basic loop. So you have to differentiate between the two. You have to differentiate between the two. So I want you to like just go through it. And then when we come into our next class, we're going to have it more in that. Now, again, if you look at this, let's say, for example, if you look at the way the values for the for loop has been used here, you see there's been used it in ascending order, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. What happens if we want to start from 30 or start or have it in a reverse way or in descending order? Now you can just have this declare, repeat the same thing, but this time around, in between here, you can have what? In reverse. You can have reverse. And then let's say here, TBMS. Now you can see now, the lowest is actually 10. Because we've just used what? Because we've just used the word reverse. So we are reversing it. This one is that it's supposed to start from the highest to the lowest. And both of them are still what? Both of them are still the for loop, and that tells us the three types of the main common types of loops: the basic loop, the while loop, and the for loop. So ensure that you go through the video, like you can even repeat it, rerun it and rerun it until you understand how can we write the basic loops, how can we write the while loop, and how can we write the for loop. Remember, for the basic loop, the sequence of statements is executed and the control resumes at the top of the loop. That's why we had the exit. The while loop repeats a statement or group of statements while a given condition is true. And then for the for loop, this one executes a sequence of statements multiple times and abbreviates the code that manages the loop variable. So that actually closes the chapter of writing control structures in connection to writing if statements, writing case expressions, and of course, the loops. Now, so something else, the main objective of me recording this particular video is for you guys to go through them, and then later we will come and revisit it. And this is in line with the SQL Cursor. So I'm introducing SQL Cursors. And now I want us to do another chapter, another topic. This about working with composite data types. Working with composite data types. Working with composite data types. Now, if you remember, in PLSQL, we have like two types of variables or data types. We have PLSQL variables, let's say PLSQL variables, and this covers different data types. We have, for example, the scalar data type. We have LOB, large objects. We have composite. And of course, on the other side, we have non-PLSQL variables. And this is covered by the bind variable. If you remember, we have bind variable or host variable. Now, here I want to elaborate something clearly. I know we've been using the scalar data type, not mentioning even the LOB, but I want to bring the differences between the scalar data type and the composite data type, although both of them are PLSQL variables. Now, the question that some of you may pose is that, how can I, let's say, display multiple or retrieve multiple records from the database? Let's say, for example, I want to capture 10 employees. Now, what will happen if I want to capture a single employee? So if you want to capture a single employee, that means you will be connected to using the scalar data type. Using scalar data type, that will allow you to retrieve a single row or a single record at a time. And I think this is actually the very thing we started with, especially when we are retrieving data with PLSQL or manipulating data with PLSQL value. So what happens is scalar data types are always connected to a single value. LOB for this case, because I have it here, I've just written, this one is connected to either saving images, so we'll still talk about this. But now I want to talk about the composite data type, which of course this chapter is all about. So for composite data type is actually a word that comes from the word composition or composed of. When you talk about composition, that means two things actually are involved. When you talk about composed of, it means that two things again are going to be involved. And this is the direct opposite of what? The scalar data type. So this is the reason why we need to talk about this particular point. Now, if, for example, I do this, let's say declare, I want to have a, let's say, F name. This one is a voucher, 220. Okay. And then I have like begin. Having begin, we'll talk about select name. Okay, let's say first underscore name into fname from employees, where employee ID equals to 126. And then I will have the DBMS underscore output underscore line into bracket fname. And then end, and then put that. Now look at that. You see, PLSQL procedure successfully completed. And this tells us what? This tells us that the type of or the value that has been retrieved is only a single value. And this is the reason why I've actually used a scalar data type. So scalar data type will actually tell you more about using the varchar, this particular data type. It will tell you to use number data type. It will tell you to use date data type, especially when you're declaring a variable, especially when you're using the anonymous block. So even on the execution part, if you look at the select statement, we are ending at using the 126. Now, let me just do the opposite. I will just repeat the same thing. This time round, I don't want to involve the employee ID. I want to end it at here. And then I will just bring up the select DBMS, yeah, and then end, and then put that. Look at that. Look at the error. Read at the error. Now, in Oracle database, you'll find that whenever you encounter an error, you'll always find something called the error code, ORA 01422, ORA 06512. These are predefined errors or predefined exceptions because a code has to be typed to it. When it comes to handling errors, we will discuss this at length. Now, here it means that the first area tells us what? Exact fetch returns more than requested number of rows. Because why? You cannot actually use type of block to display multiple records. At the same time, you cannot actually use this particular data type to display multiple records again. So what happens is we have like a problem at line 4. You can see again what we are looking at line 4 is an extension of where. If we had like where employee ID equals to 126, then we could actually have a flow. But in this case, we end up getting one record, which of course is results of a scalar data type. Now, how can we do now, or how can we fetch multiple records? How can we fetch multiple records? Now, number one, when we talk about composite data types, we have two types. Number one, we have something called the PLSQL records. These records now, the PLSQL records are used, let me just use, are used to retrieve, multiple records of different data types. Now, this means what? This means that you can actually combine the dates. You can combine, let's say you can combine like 10 employees, and you through the 10 employees, you're able to display the first names of all the 10 employees, the hire date for all the 10 employees, and the salary for all the 10 employees. That means the name is character, the hire date is the date, and of course the salary is a number. And this tells us about the different data types. Number two is PLSQL collections. Now, for PLSQL collections, these are used, again, both of them have something in common. They are used to retrieve multiple rows or multiple records. Let's say records of similar